There is a terrifying roulette game you play every time you book a cruise stateroom. Who exactly is on the other side of that frosted balcony divider? Today, we are exploring 12 deeply unsettling stories of cruise ship neighbors who brought absolute, unadulterated chaos to the high seas. If you thought hoarding pool chairs was bad, you severely lack imagination. Let's begin. 1. There is a very specific, unspoken etiquette to ordering late-night cruise ship room service, specifically regarding what you do with the dirty dishes afterward. Most normal humans either leave the tray neatly on their own desk or place it quietly outside their own door for the steward to collect in the morning. But a couple from Chicago staying in cabin 9044 discovered that their neighbor Walter viewed hallway waste management as a highly strategic, competitive sport. Walter, occupying the slightly larger mini-suite next door, apparently possessed a nocturnal metabolism that required vast quantities of pungent seafood at 2 in the morning. On the second morning of the cruise, the couple opened their door to head to breakfast and nearly tripped over a towering, highly unstable stack of dirty plates smelling intensely of garlic butter, discarded lobster shells, and half-eaten smoked salmon. They assumed the exhausted night steward had simply placed it there by mistake. But on day 3, a massive metal tray featuring 3 hollowed-out shrimp cocktail bowls, a stained gravy boat, and roughly a dozen empty tartar sauce ramekins appeared perfectly centered directly on their welcome mat. Walter simply didn't want his premium cabin smelling like a coastal fish market while he slept, so he was systematically exporting his culinary garbage to the cheaper adjacent rooms. Tell me honestly, how many days of stepping over heavily buttered crustaceans would it take before you lost your absolute mind and started throwing ceramic plates overboard? The couple decided to simply slide the pungent tray back in front of Walter's door to send a clear message. But this only triggered a bizarre, silent turf war. The husband woke up at 3:30 in the morning to use the restroom and heard the distinct muted scrape of heavy ceramic sliding across the hallway carpet. He yanked the door open to find Walter, a 60-something man in a silk monogrammed bathrobe, caught mid-squat, physically pushing a plate of half-eaten crab legs toward their doorframe with a specialized shuffleboard technique. Walter didn't panic or run away in shame. He simply stood up, adjusted the heavy belt of his silk robe, and adopted the haughty tone of a disappointed aristocrat. He calmly explained that as a premium mini-suite guest, he was contractually entitled to a neutral odor zone in his immediate corridor. And since they were in a standard balcony cabin, they were geographically designated to absorb the ship's ambient smells. The couple was so stunned by the sheer, unadulterated audacity of this logic that they just stood there in absolute silence. Walter seized the opportunity to gently tap the dirty tray with his expensive leather slipper, sliding it another 2 inches toward their door, and softly requested that they please not stack the plates too high, as he found disorganized garbage visually upsetting on his way to the morning buffet. 2. Inside an interior cabin on deck 4 of a luxury European line, a 30-year-old solo traveler named Sarah discovered that the most terrifying thing about connecting doors isn't the lack of soundproofing, but what happens when the person on the other side views the bottom gap as a dedicated postal slot. Her neighbor was an elderly woman named Frau Muller, who possessed an obsession with maritime regulations that bordered on the fanatical. The correspondence began on the second morning. Sarah woke up to find a perfectly crisp, heavily perfumed piece of ship stationery slid under the connecting door. It read, in immaculate cursive, "Your shower ran for exactly 8 minutes. The maritime standard is 6. Please adjust." Sarah assumed it was a bizarre joke and threw it away. But the next morning, another note appeared. "You dropped a shoe at 11:42 p.m. The resulting acoustic shockwave disturbed my circadian rhythm." Sarah, trying to be a good sport, finally slid a note back under the door that simply said, "Sorry, I will be more careful." She stepped back, waiting. Not even 30 seconds later, the exact same piece of paper was violently shoved back under the door into her room. Frau Muller had crossed out Sarah's apology with a thick red marker and written a single chilling sentence at the bottom. "Apologies do not correct structural vibrations, only absolute stillness does." Sarah spent the rest of the voyage tiptoeing around her cabin like a burglar in a museum, absolutely terrified of triggering the aggressive stationery dispenser living on the other side of the wall. 3. There is an unwritten social contract when you step out onto your private veranda, and it inherently implies a certain level of isolation. A gentleman from Milan named Enzo, occupying cabins 7 and 122, simply did not grasp the basic geometric limitations of personal space. His neighbors, a quiet couple from Perth, first met him on embarkation afternoon when a pair of stainless steel buffet tongs slowly emerged around the edge of the frosted glass divider, gripping a single, heavily bruised strawberry. There was no friendly greeting and no verbal introduction. Just the quiet rustle of the sea breeze and a piece of fruit hovering in midair like a bizarre offering to a confused deity. Over the next 5 days, Enzo treated the edge of that partition like an international culinary border crossing. He possessed a terrifying sixth sense for knowing exactly when his neighbors had sat down to read a book in peace. The tongs would silently emerge from the void, offering a weird rotation of items liberated from the Lido deck. A single dinner roll, a slightly damp hash brown, or on one highly memorable formal night, an entire peeled hard-boiled egg. The tongs would just patiently wait there in their peripheral vision, sometimes for up to 10 minutes, gently waving the food item back and forth until someone finally acknowledged it. When the husband ultimately leaned around the glass on day 6 to firmly ask him to stop, he found Enzo sitting completely motionless in a deck chair in the dark, wearing reflective aviator sunglasses. Enzo slowly retracted the tongs, nodded solemnly, and whispered that he was just establishing a reliable barter system in case the ship suddenly ran out of fuel. 4. You would naturally assume the worst thing a cruise ship neighbor could possibly do is play their television at maximum volume or slam their heavy metal door at 2 in the morning, but that honestly shows a severe lack of imagination. The occupants of cabin 6112 on a massive 4,000-passenger megaship learned this the hard way when they found themselves unwittingly living next door to an underground, highly illegal formalwear pressing syndicate. The absolute chaos officially began on the morning of day 3, when the husband in 6112 stepped out into the hallway in his bathrobe to check for his breakfast tray and bumped into 4 grown men holding heavily wrinkled suits, standing in a neat single-file line against the wall. The men politely asked if he was the one taking the 10 o'clock appointments. It quickly turned out that the occupant of cabin 6114, an enterprising 20-something Australian named Marcus, had somehow managed to smuggle a full-sized industrial-grade garment steamer aboard by hiding it inside a massive canvas golf bag. Recognizing that the ship's official laundry service took 24 hours and cost a small fortune, Marcus had covertly slipped hand-printed business cards under hundreds of cabin doors during the night, offering instant suit pressing for $20 cash. By the afternoon of the very first formal night, the narrow hallway outside of 6112 smelled intensely of hot ozone, heavy laundry starch, and damp wool. The foot traffic was completely relentless. People were showing up in their underwear, holding crumpled evening gowns, engaging in hushed, dramatic negotiations outside the door like they were buying illicit substances in a dark alley. The mechanical heat radiating through the shared wall was so intense that the innocent couple in 6112 noticed their complimentary chocolate mints had completely melted into a puddle on the nightstand, and their bathroom mirror was permanently fogged. After enduring 6 hours of continuous knocking, strangers casually leaning against their doorframe, and the sound of a pressurized steam valve hissing like an angry dragon every 3 minutes, they finally cracked and called guest services. Maritime security did not find this entrepreneurial spirit amusing in the slightest. 4 officers arrived in the corridor, knocked loudly on Marcus's door, and conducted a swift raid of the premises. They confiscated the massive steamer, a collapsible ironing board he had hidden under his mattress, and 3 heavy cans of industrial aerosol starch. Marcus was given a stern official warning. The hallway was immediately cleared and peace was supposedly restored to deck 6. The couple in 6112 breathed a massive sigh of relief, happy to finally enjoy a quiet, undisturbed evening before heading down to their own formal dinner. But here is the beautiful thing about underground economies. They completely lack standardized customer service protocols. Just picture the sheer, terrifying confusion of opening your door dressed for a nice evening, only to face a hostile mob demanding you release their formal wear. Because at 6 o'clock, that is exactly what happened. When security raided the room, Marcus had completely panicked. He had successfully taken possession of roughly 30 expensive suits and dresses just before the bust, but since his equipment was confiscated, He couldn't process them. So, to logically deflect the immediate wrath of his loyal clientele, Marcus had simply taped a handwritten sign to his own door that read, "Operations temporarily suspended. The people in 6112 called security and ruined it for everyone. Please ask them for your clothes back." For the next 3 agonizing hours, while Marcus absolutely refused to answer his heavily barricaded door, the innocent couple had to personally negotiate with a hallway full of desperate, furious passengers who were absolutely convinced that their expensive tuxedos and sequined gowns were locked inside as some sort of sick, twisted revenge plot. They literally had to invite a retired judge from Chicago into their room to inspect their closets just to definitively prove they weren't running a rogue maritime pawn shop. 5. Participating in cabin door decorating is a beloved cruise tradition for many. But a woman named Brenda in cabin 1024 treated the corridor like her own personal, highly aggressive scrapbook. 2 young guys from Boston, staying right next door in 1026, noticed on embarkation day that Brenda had covered her metal door in roughly 80 customized magnetic flamingos. That is excessive, but ultimately harmless in the grand scheme of maritime eccentricities. By day 3, however, the flamingo migration officially began. The guys woke up to find 6 bright pink magnetic birds on their own door, forming a neat little conga line pointing directly toward Brenda's cabin. When they peeled them off and respectfully placed them back on her doorframe, Brenda did not take the hint. Instead, she took it as a direct creative challenge. The next morning, their door was completely annexed. Brenda had covered their keycard slot with a laminated banner that read "Flamingo Lounge Guest Annex" and applied an intricate mosaic of neon magnets spelling out the guys' first names, which she had evidently eavesdropped to learn. When they finally knocked to politely ask her to stop bedazzling their entryway, Brenda didn't even apologize. She simply cracked the door open, sighed heavily with intense disappointment, and handed them a handwritten invoice for $14 to cover her laminating costs and the unappreciated narrative expansion of their dull metal door. 6. There is an unspoken assumption that whatever you do inside the 4 walls of your stateroom is your own business, provided it doesn't fundamentally alter the structural integrity of the ship. A solo traveler named Mark, booked in an interior cabin on Deck 7, discovered that his neighbor possessed a very liberal interpretation of this rule. The neighbor, a self-proclaimed holistic wellness guru from California, had decided the recycled ship air was entirely unacceptable for his respiratory aura. Without alerting the cabin steward, he had successfully smuggled aboard a massive, industrial-grade greenhouse humidifier. He wasn't just adding a little moisture to the room, he was actively terraforming the space. By the second evening, the shared connecting door between their cabins began to weep thick, continuous beads of condensation. Mark initially thought a plumbing pipe had burst, but then the intense, suffocating smell of concentrated eucalyptus, damp soil, and wet bamboo seeped under the gap. It was exactly like living next door to a highly aggressive tropical rainforest. Mark's complimentary daily cruise compass began to physically curl into a damp, soggy tube on his desk. His clean shirts in the closet felt permanently clammy, and the mirrors in his bathroom remained perpetually fogged, forcing him to shave entirely by muscle memory. There is a very specific, deeply unsettling brand of panic that sets in when your complimentary pillow mint starts dissolving from ambient room moisture. Mark called guest services, but before security could arrive to investigate the climate anomaly, the situation escalated from bizarre to completely unhinged. Mark was sitting on his damp bed when a thin, flexible plastic tube slowly emerged from the gap under the connecting door. It slithered out about 3 inches onto Mark's carpet, followed immediately by a pressurized hiss as a thick cloud of highly fragrant vapor blasted directly into his room. The neighbor had actually engineered a crude ventilation system using a modified snorkel tube to forcibly share his wellness. When security finally breached the neighboring cabin, they found the man sitting cross-legged on a damp towel in his underwear, surrounded by a white fog so dense they couldn't even see the television screen. His only defense was a stern warning to the confused officers that abruptly disrupting his artificial monsoon would drastically shock his pores and completely misalign his nautical chakras. 7. Booking a premium midship balcony on a massive ocean liner is supposed to guarantee you front row seats to the tranquility of the sea. For Dave and Linda, a retired couple from Ohio, it instead guaranteed them front row seats to Gary. Gary was the sole occupant of cabin 8204, and from the moment the ship blasted its departure horn, he decided he was the vessel's unofficial, self-appointed nautical observer. He didn't just sit on his balcony, he established a tactical command center. Gary dragged his heavy metal table to the exact edge of the frosted glass partition, set up an aluminum camping chair he had somehow smuggled aboard, strapped a pair of massive military-grade binoculars around his neck, and began verbally dictating an aggressively detailed maritime log into a handheld microcassette recorder. He did this every 20 minutes, from dawn until midnight, in a voice that sounded like a retired news anchor trying to project over a hurricane. Try to calculate the exact amount of self-control required to not just grab the man's cassette player and toss it directly into the Atlantic while you're trying to read a paperback. At first, Gary's audio journal was purely environmental. He would record wind speed estimates, cloud formations, and the exact coordinates of passing container ships. Before we find out exactly what pushed Gary to his breaking point, if you are finding these tales of maritime madness entertaining, go ahead and click that subscribe button. It immensely helps the channel and guarantees your spot for the next batch of bizarre vacationers. Anyway, back to Gary and his relentless ocean surveillance. By day 3 of the 7-night voyage, Gary simply ran out of weather to observe and turned his tactical gaze toward his neighbors. Dave and Linda would simply walk outside to get some fresh air and immediately hear a loud click followed by Gary whispering loudly, 1400 hours. The civilians on the port side have emerged. The male is consuming what appears to be a stale croissant. Morale seems stable, but their sunburn is progressing. Dave tried the diplomatic approach, leaning around the glass divider to politely ask Gary if he could maybe keep his operational reports internal. Gary didn't even blink. He just slowly lowered his binoculars, clicked his recorder, and said directly into the microphone, 1405 hours. The portside civilians are attempting to initiate a mutiny. I will maintain my post. The absolute dedication to the bit was almost impressive until day 5 when the ship hit a mild storm. While everyone else safely stayed inside, Gary stood drenched in his bathrobe, gripping the railing, yelling into his recorder that the ship was taking on invisible water and he was fully prepared to go down with the vessel. Security had to physically escort him inside at 2 in the morning, not because he was a danger, but because his dramatic screaming was making the people in the suites below think they had sailed onto the set of a disaster movie. 8. Cruise lines provide you with incredibly comfortable mattresses, so there is an unspoken assumption that you will actually sleep in the expensive bed provided to you. 2 friends on a Hawaiian itinerary discovered their neighbor, an incredibly intense outdoor enthusiast named Greg, completely disagreed with this basic premise. Greg firmly believed that sleeping indoors was a psychological crutch. On the very first night, the friends stepped onto their balcony and noticed the distinct sound of heavy synthetic fabric rustling loudly next door. They peeked around the partition and saw that Greg had miraculously managed to erect a fully functional 2-person nylon dome tent on his narrow 60-square-foot balcony. Because he couldn't drive traditional metal stakes into the ship's steel decking, he had improvised by wedging stolen heavy ceramic dining plates under the tent poles and tying the guy lines directly to the balcony railing using complex nautical knots. The tent took up the entire footprint of the balcony, meaning Greg had to physically crawl out of his sliding glass door directly into the zippered flap. For 5 straight days, he lived in that bubble, aggressively unzipping his flap at dawn to loudly boil water on a portable hot plate while wearing a headlamp. When the friends finally asked him why he was voluntarily camping on a luxury vessel, Greg adjusted his heavy fleece vest, despite being off the warm coast of Maui. He confidently explained that the ship's central air conditioning was artificially weakening his immune system, and he was simply preparing his physical form for the harsh realities of a 4-hour guided bus tour. 9. There is a strict, undeniable hierarchy to the cabins on a modern megaship, but a passenger named Julian in cabin 11047 decided that the standard deck plan lacked a certain level of exclusive, high-stakes nightlife. The innocent couple staying right next door in 11045, Ryan and Emma, first realized their hallway was compromised on the 3rd night of a 10-day Caribbean sailing. At roughly 11 o'clock, Ryan opened his door to check if he had left his wet swimsuit on the balcony, only to find three grown men in full, impeccably pressed tuxedos standing silently in the narrow corridor. One of them was holding a heavy braided red velvet stanchion rope that he had very obviously unscrewed and stolen from the ship's main casino. When Ryan asked what on earth was going on, the men aggressively shushed him, checked their oversized luxury watches, and whispered that they were waiting for the Pelican Room to open. Julian, it turned out, was running a highly covert rogue speakeasy out of his standard 200-square-foot balcony cabin. By night 5, the foot traffic outside Ryan and Emma's door was absolutely relentless and incredibly bizarre. Julian had recruited a massive guy he met at the Lido Deck belly flop competition to act as a physical bouncer, placing him in a stolen folding chair right outside 11047 with a plastic clipboard and a tiny flashlight. Imagine trying to sleep while a man aggressively guards a piece of velvet rope inches from your headboard, demanding a maritime password from confused, half-drunk tourists. The couple was constantly being woken up by people knocking on their door by mistake, leaning into their keyhole and whispering absurd phrases like, "The captain walks at midnight." When Ryan finally cornered Julian by the glass elevators to demand he shut the entire rogue operation down, Julian didn't apologize or show a single ounce of shame. He simply straightened his velvet blazer, slipped a heavily embossed fake platinum membership card into Ryan's shirt pocket, and magnanimously offered him permanent line-skipping privileges. The breaking point arrived on night 7 when Ryan stepped into the hallway in his socks and his foot actually stuck to the carpet. The corridor smelled intensely, not of spilled alcohol or cheap cologne, but of aggressive, pungent garlic, melted butter, and warm cocktail sauce. Ryan immediately called maritime security, assuming they were about to bust a massive underground alcohol smuggling ring or an illegal drug operation. 6 heavily trained officers breached Julian's cabin, fully expecting to find bathtubs full of illegal liquor and wads of cash scattered on the mattress. The reality they uncovered was profoundly more absurd. Julian wasn't selling alcohol at all. He had meticulously rearranged his cabin furniture to create a miniature, fully functioning craps table using a green pool towel and a roulette wheel made from a stolen dining room Lazy Susan. But the twist that absolutely broke the security team's brains was the currency. There wasn't a single dollar bill or casino chip in the room. 15 fully grown adults in evening wear were actively, intensely gambling with massive, premium jumbo shrimp they had systematically smuggled out of the specialty seafood restaurant in napkin-lined purses and jacket pockets. Julian had successfully created an entirely closed, underground crustacean economy right under the captain's nose. When the officers physically dragged Julian out into the hallway, Ryan peeked into the room and saw the ultimate, unbelievable punchline. Julian had filled his cabin's entire ice bucket, the bathroom sink, and the mini fridge with crushed ice just to safely store the house edge, which consisted of roughly 400 heavily guarded, perfectly peeled shrimp that he was planning to cash out at the midnight buffet. 10. Booking a solo balcony stateroom usually guarantees you a tranquil, uninterrupted view of the ocean, but a woman named Ingrid discovered that it can also make you the target of a deeply confusing, maritime phantom. Ingrid, a 30-something architect from Stockholm, woke up on the second morning of her Mediterranean cruise, stepped out onto her private veranda, and found a perfectly folded, intricate paper origami swan sitting squarely in the center of her glass table. She assumed the cabin steward had left it as a cute alternative to a towel animal. But the next morning, an incredibly complex paper dragon appeared. By day 4, there was a magnificent 3-dimensional origami lotus flower waiting for her. Ingrid was thrilled. She became absolutely convinced that she had a secret, highly romantic admirer on the ship who was risking life and limb to lean over the frosted glass divider in the dead of night to leave her these beautiful tokens of affection. On the 5th night, she decided to stay awake, sitting quietly in the dark corner of her cabin, waiting to catch a glimpse of her mysterious Romeo. At 2 in the morning, she heard a faint metallic sliding sound. She held her breath as a long, silver telescopic pole slowly extended around the edge of the glass partition. Attached to the very end of it was a tiny paper frog, gripping the metal with a piece of double-sided tape. The pole gently lowered the frog onto her table, gave a little shake to release the tape, and quickly retracted. Ingrid rushed out and peeked around the divider, fully expecting to see a handsome stranger. Instead, she locked eyes with her neighbor, a 72-year-old retired civil engineer wearing a CPAP machine mask. He calmly retracted his 15-foot telescopic golf ball retriever, looked her dead in the eye, and bluntly explained that he simply loved folding paper to ease his insomnia, but firmly believed that keeping the finished animals on his own table created unnecessary visual clutter. 11. Modern cruise ships offer state-of-the-art cabin telephones, but a passenger named Victor in cabin 8102 firmly believed that digital communication was inherently compromised by corporate listening devices. The young couple from Vancouver staying in the adjacent balcony room, Sam and Chloe, discovered Victor's absolute distrust of modern technology on the second afternoon of their Mexican Riviera sailing. They were quietly enjoying a glass of wine and watching the sunset when a heavy plastic souvenir cup, attached to a tightly pulled piece of white nautical twine, suddenly swung around the frosted glass divider and aggressively whacked Sam directly in the shoulder. Before they could even process the airborne projectile, the string went completely taut, and a raspy, disembodied voice echoed out of the cup, demanding to know if they had visually confirmed the arrival of the starboard pilot boat. Victor had actually engineered a classic, elementary school-style string and cup communication network at sea. The couple naturally assumed it was a quirky, one-time icebreaker from an eccentric older gentleman. It takes a monumental level of psychological endurance to ignore a bright green plastic cup that is violently vibrating against your metal railing, while a grown man whispers urgent maritime updates through a piece of tensioned twine. By day 4, Victor had completely abandoned verbal communication and upgraded his primitive network into a fully functional, high-tension pulley system designed for physical cargo. The couple would be sitting outside, minding their own business, when the cup would slowly zip across the gap carrying incredibly bizarre, unsolicited items. At 10 in the morning, they received a single, slightly damp herbal tea bag. At noon, the cup delivered a laminated clipping from a 1998 travel magazine about the extreme dangers of unprotected sun exposure. Sam finally decided to just humor the man to keep the peace. He wrote a polite note that simply said, "Thanks, but we are fine," placed it in the cup, and gave the string a gentle double tug to send it back. This was a catastrophic tactical error because it legally validated Victor's infrastructure. On the final sea day, the couple woke up to find that Victor had bypassed the plastic cup entirely and somehow managed to clip an entire, heavy porcelain plate of lukewarm buffet scrambled eggs to the string, slowly winching it toward their balcony like a high-altitude helicopter rescue operation. When the plate inevitably tipped and dropped the eggs directly onto the deck below, Victor didn't apologize. He simply reeled the empty string back in, leaned completely over the glass, and sternly informed them that they were now permanently cut off from his emergency supply chain due to their unforgivable failure to secure the breakfast payload. 12. Every standard cruise ship publishes a daily schedule of events, usually consisting of predictable, low-stakes activities like morning trivia, pool volleyball, and maybe a gentle towel folding demonstration. But a passenger named Reginald in cabin 9024 firmly believed that the official entertainment division was a complete insult to the human attention span. The young couple staying right next door in 9022, Mark and Sarah, discovered this on the second morning of their Mediterranean sailing, when a glossy, professionally printed pamphlet was silently slipped under their door. It was titled The Underground Itinerary. While the main ship was hosting a mild Sudoku challenge at 10 o'clock, Reginald's pamphlet advertised high-stakes carpet bowling and blindfolded champagne tasting inside his standard balcony stateroom. Mark and Sarah assumed it was a bizarre, eccentric joke. That is, until exactly 5 minutes to 10, when they watched 14 overly enthusiastic adults cram into Reginald's 200-square-foot room. Reginald, wearing a fully sequined crimson blazer at 10 in the morning, stood by his bathroom door with a stolen megaphone, enthusiastically welcoming his rogue audience. For the next 4 days, Mark and Sarah were trapped next to a man running a completely parallel, shadow government entertainment division. The noise was absolutely deafening. When the cruise director hosted a formal art auction, Reginald hosted a highly aggressive seminar on the history of international cheese smuggling, complete with visual aids and loud, dramatic gasps from his surprisingly loyal audience. He organized a completely unauthorized miniature golf tournament in the corridor, using rolled-up socks and a heavy brass shoehorn. Everyone has a breaking point, and I suspect yours would arrive right around the moment 30 adults start loudly cheering for bruised fruit magic tricks on the other side of your drywall. The crowd grew exponentially every single day. People were literally skipping the main theater's multi-million-dollar Broadway-style production just to sit cross-legged on Reginald's mattress and watch him demonstrate how to build a functioning compass out of a wine cork and a stolen hairpin. The breaking point arrived on day 5 when Reginald attempted to host indoor synchronized swimming on his balcony using a child's inflatable wading pool and several buckets of tap water. Mark and Sarah finally snapped and called guest services. A team of 4 maritime security officers breached the room, expecting to shut down a highly lucrative, illegal commercial enterprise. They immediately demanded to see Reginald's cash box, assuming he was charging a massive cover fee to these gullible passengers. Reginald was profoundly offended by the accusation. He aggressively adjusted his sequined lapels and informed the officers that he wasn't charging a single dime. In fact, he was personally losing thousands of dollars because he was ordering premium room service caviar and endless bottles of champagne to freely distribute to his guests. The unbelievable twist of the century was that Reginald was not a frustrated aspiring entertainer or a grifter trying to build a cult. He was a highly successful, intensely petty corporate liquidator from Boston who was currently in the middle of a vicious, high-stakes divorce. He had somehow discovered that his wife's ruthless divorce attorney was taking a vacation on this exact ship, staying in cabin 9A26. Reginald had spent a small fortune to book the room directly adjacent to the lawyer, hire a professional graphic designer for the pamphlets, and host these elaborate, chaotic, wall-shaking room parties with one singular, beautifully unhinged goal. He wanted to generate so much constant, localized ambient noise and hallway foot traffic that the attorney would get absolutely 0 hours of peace for the entire 7-day voyage. Mark and Sarah were completely forgotten collateral damage. The Rogue Cruise Director Act wasn't about bringing joy to the masses. It was a highly sophisticated, financially ruinous acoustic weapon deployed by a man who fundamentally understood that the best revenge is a crowded room playing blindfolded carpet bowling at 3 in the morning. Be honest. If you watched this and thought, well, the underground shrimp casino actually sounds like a solid business model, I need you to out yourself in the comments right now so the rest of us know exactly who to avoid at the buffet. Seriously, confess your worst cruise habit below, and if you enjoy aggressively judging strangers as much as I do, hit subscribe and like.